Wesh, hello, Irko Amne A. I'm ranking the best songs of 2023 from number 100 to number 1 based on the only metric that matters, my infallible taste. Doing things slightly differently this week because I am not going to be doing 10 songs in one bunch as usual, but focusing exclusively on this one song as we're right at the middle mark of my list at number 50 here with the Motorsport Kevlar Notre Competition by French rapper producer duo Irko Amne A. Don't worry, I'm not going to do this for every single song in the top 50. In fact, next week, if I can get it done by then, there'll be a video for every song from position 49 to position 31 in one video. But as I was going through my list of songs that I picked, noticing this one, remembering this as the highlight of the Danger Rapproché album of these two artists, I realized that I could probably extrapolate quite a lot from this one track and do a sort of very personalized, very outside looking in history of French hip-hop. Now, when I state quite plainly and unambiguously on the record here that I am not presently, nor have I ever been, French, but I have listened to my fair share of French hip-hop over the years, and so while I'm perhaps not the best authority to provide this, I thought that these two artists would be a really interesting starting point to look at the history of French hip-hop and to hopefully introduce you to some gems in the process if this is a scene that you're interested in exploring, which I would encourage you to do. But because I will later in this video call this young up-and-coming French-Albanian rapper from Lyon one of the best French hip-hop artists working right now, which is perhaps a bit of a controversial statement for this fairly underground and in the mainstream fairly unknown rapper, I want to first state what I actually mean when talking about a great hip-hop artist as distinguished from a great rapper, because those two aren't necessarily the same thing. There's often a lot of crossover. I mean, hip-hop and rap tend to be used synonymously as the names for the same musical genre, but it's essentially two different approaches valuing or kind of centering different elements in the craft, with rap being focused on the lyrical, the vocal, the poetic songwriting side of things, and hip-hop being more of a genre focused more on the musical, the melodic, and on the general soundscape of things. You can find parallels to this in other genres like rock music, for example, where you can maybe have a really skilled guitar virtuoso that is not able to translate that skill, that technical adeptness into accomplished or enjoyable records because they're too focused on kind of noodling around and showing off, which in rap you can probably find plenty of examples of that. But on the other hand, you can also get plenty of hip-hop artists that aren't necessarily particularly great rappers. I mean, I'd say two of the foremost and two of the best hip-hop artists of the 21st century so far, Kanye West and Playboi Carti, aren't particularly good rappers by any standard, but it doesn't matter because their musical approach is more holistic than that, and their style, which is limited, fits perfectly into a larger collage of fairly radical and fairly innovative sounds. And this is more of the lineage that will place Irko Amne in with this song and this album. If you're a rap fan, even just a casual one, you've probably noticed this already on some level, or even maybe verbalized it to yourself or friends. And it comes down to the fact that we expect a lot of different things from a hip-hop artist, and rapping is merely one part of it. Or even within rapping, I mean, you can separate or you can distinguish between the lyrical content, be that the wordplay, be that the deeper thematic significance, the meaning, or the lyrical poetic value of it, and the charisma, the flow, the variation, the voice, all of which is at least as important and can sometimes be more important. I'm not saying this in a way that you should take these individual markers or attributes and rank a given rapper based on how they perform at each of them, but more see it as a way that you can be talented in any one of those categories and then compensate for a lack of talent in the other categories, right? And so I've always thought that approaching hip-hop from a purely lyrical standpoint is a fairly myopic take on the genre, is one that's been increasingly shattered by the dominance of cloud rap and mumble rap in the 2010s and 2020s, which is a trend that I greatly appreciate because I think it broadens people's horizons on what hip-hop can be, taken away from the sort of purely lyrical with shackles, almost, I want to call them. And, you know, it's a silly way of thinking about it as well, because and any hip-hop fan worth their salt will tell you this, if you look at some of the most influential hip-hop albums, you'll have to mention a few that are instrumental hip-hop outright. You know, instrumental hip-hop is a genre, and it's an integral part of hip-hop as a larger genre. Whether you look at DJ Shadow's Introducing from the 1990s or Jay Dilla's Donuts from the 2000s, I mean, there's seminal hip-hop albums that don't feature any verses at all. And at the same time, they're still just as, if not more, influential on scenes and sounds and subgenres that developed in their wake. But colloquially, we don't really tend to make that decision, right? Within hip-hop culture, it's common to speak of the GOAT, or the king of rap. And, you know, GOAT can sometimes mean the greatest of all time, or also maybe just the greatest of the present moment, the greatest rapper active right now. And when it comes to making that assessment, which is almost kind of like a community-chosen poet laureate within hip-hop, it tends to be a mixture of the rapping side of things and of the hip-hop side of things. But there's more on top of that as well. And the position that a rapper occupies within that culture is paramount to understanding that. And I think a good way of making sense of this is by looking at the present GOAT. Some would say the best of all time. I would disagree, but that doesn't matter. Kendrick Lamar, right? Kendrick Lamar has, I think, unquestionably been at the throne of hip-hop since at least 2024, when he seemingly lastingly discredited Drake in the public eye. He's not been able to stage a convincing comeback or regain his past commercial success at a sustained level in the 2 years since. But the reason that Kendrick has climbed to the top of that throne is not just because he outsmarted Drake with, you know, his lyrical density over the course of that very publicized feud between the two rappers. It's because after doing so, and remember, Pusha T had previously beaten Drake in a rap battle, but that didn't make Pusha T the most important rapper. That didn't make Pusha T the GOAT, even though he's a brilliant rapper. I'm not saying this to diss him at all, but Pusha T obviously has never had the dominance on hip-hop culture that Kendrick Lamar currently enjoys. And the reason that Kendrick Lamar currently enjoys that is because after beating Drake with Not Like Us, he then also made Not Like Us into a chart-topping, summer-defining, year-defining classic of a single. One of the best hip-hop songs of the last couple of years. He played it multiple times at his shows. He made a victory lap music video for it. He released GNX as a celebratory and very sort of mainstream oriented, but still very high quality hip hop album. He performed at the Super Bowl. I mean, he won the Grammys, and that's the sort of cultural dimension that we're talking about when we try to define who the GOAT is at any present moment. But there's a fourth and last point of that is very important as well, and which intersects with what I've talked about just there, and that's the performativity aspect of it, which is obviously deeply ingrained within hip-hop. Hip-hop, again, more so than other musical genres, is a very performative genre. You know, the wrestling term of kayfabe is applicable to a lot of hip-hop. Rapping about something that you've not necessarily done isn't tantamount to lying. It's playing a persona, but it's more than that as well. It's more than just, rapping bars about, selling dope when you haven't necessarily done that. It's also performing something more ineffable, presenting as this kind of cultural figure, which Kendrick has only really, beyond any reasonable doubt, embodied since 2024. He had 2 10 out of 10 classic albums before that point, and many hip-hop fans would understandably call him the best rapper at any point post Good Kid Mad City. But it's really with his victory over Drake and with the following victory lap that he has performed that GOAT status in the eyes of the world, in the eyes of hip-hop culture at large. And to compare this to someone who I would actually say has on a merely musical and lyrical level been consistently much better than Kendrick Lamar in the last 5 years, but who is nevertheless not a feasible candidate in the GOAT discussion. You've got Billy Woods, right? Who is a far more underground rapper who simply doesn't chase that mainstream success in a way that Kendrick has chosen to, especially in the last couple of years. And that's not a value statement on either rapper. I'm not saying Billy Woods is a lesser rapper because he doesn't know how to make pop hits. And I'm not saying Kendrick Lamar has become a worse rapper since he has been able to do so. The beautiful thing about hip hop as a genre is that it's able to contain both of those extremes, along with so many other, more commercial and more experimental and everything in between approaches to it. But when we talk about the GOAT, that performativity is a central element within it. Billy Woods is a present and future cult rapper with plenty of classics under his belt, with a really, really stellar discography. His solo career, his many collaborations, his Arm & Hammer project, but he is simply not at the cultural level of dominance that Kendrick Lamar now is. And to use a different example, look at MF Doom, who, again, now is commonly recognized as one of the best to ever do it, and you could very easily include him in a top 5 all-time rapper discussion without being looked at askance. But he wasn't the GOAT during his lifetime, during the time that his best projects, be it Mad Villainy or whatever else, were coming out, because he, like Billy Woods, didn't chase that mainstream stardom, but was content to operate in a more niche corner. MF Doom, like Billy Woods at his peak, wasn't interested in that kind of crossover success, but was a more niche, comic book obsessed nerd rapper of sorts. And that doesn't make him inauthentic or lesser in any way. It just speaks to the many different lanes that can coexist within hip hop at the same time. But if you were to make a lineage of the the GOATs or the kings of hip hop or whatever you want to call it, which is something that can be fairly cohesively done from the 90s to the present day. Tupac, Biggie, Nas, Jay-Z, maybe Eminem for a little while, and Lil Wayne and Kanye, and then it gets a bit blurrier because do you include Chief Keef, or was he too niche? Or do you include Drake? Because whatever you think of his music, he was a veritable phenomenon, and then at one point does Kendrick come in? I mean, there's a lot of debate about this, right? But MF Doom doesn't really fit into that framework the same way that Billy Woods doesn't, because they are in different corners of the hip-hop sphere. So we could say that maybe the GOAT is someone that combines being a great rapper with being a great hip-hop artist. I don't know, just one idea. The only reason that I'm going so much into detail about this and the way that it relates back to our underground French hip-hop artists here is that because, to me, as I said at the beginning of this video, this is some of the most exciting and some of the most high-quality French hip-hop, really hip-hop coming out in the world right now. And even just calling this guy one of the best French rappers right now is a big statement, because France has continuously, since hip-hop took off there in the 1990s, had the most thriving, most high-quality, and just most important and influential hip-hop scene anywhere in the world outside of the US, more so than the UK as well. I mean, you could make a case that there were brief moments during the grime era, and then when UK drill was coming up in the 2010s, that the UK was ahead and had a bigger degree of influence on other countries. But other than that, I think France has had a more consistently higher output of rappers than the UK has ever had. And even if the influence of French hip-hop isn't as evident in the US, where UK drill has, through figures like Pop Smoke, been introduced to the masses, but it has certainly extended to the rest of Europe. I mean, anywhere from Madrid to Rome to Berlin over the last decade and more, you will hear the sounds of French hip-hop reproduced. Now, so as to fulfill the promise made in the title of this video, we want to trace the history of French hip-hop from the 90s to the present day. So the 90s is really when hip-hop in France kicks off in earnest, like in many other places as well. You've got, again, like in many other places, conscious hip-hop being the dominant form of musical expression during this time, obviously built on the influence of American rap groups like Public Enemy or A Tribe Called Quest or De La Soul doing similar things. And the big artists in this tend to be groups collectives of two or more rappers working together. You've got I Am from Marseille. You've got Supreme NTM, or just NTM for short, from Paris. Wikipedia, by the way, will tell you that the NTM acronym in their name stands for Nique ta merde, or fuck your poo, which, as any French speaker in your vicinity will tell you, is hilariously wrong. It instead stands for Nique ta mère, or, fuck your mum. You've also got La Rumeur and Lunatique, both also from the suburbs of Paris. And on the solo artist front, you've got MC Solar, who is something of a Baudelaire for French hip-hop. The guy that Tyler, the Creator, chose as his alter ego a couple of albums ago, because he's got a sort of a more respectable, really quite quaint by today's standards, boom bap storytelling sound, to the extent that I remember my French teacher in high school played us his songs because it was the good sort of teaching implement. Another thing that's notable about MC Solar is that he's black, whereas most of the other, or almost all of the other rappers that I mentioned just now, are Maghrebin, so having an immigrant background from Northern Africa, from Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. And so the sound is really defined by the immigrant experience in a way that really overlaps with the way that American hip-hop, when it's first coming onto the scene in the 80s and 90s, is defined by the Black American experience. And so from that more conscious hip-hop sound of the 90s, which definitely overlaps with the styles of artists like Gang Starr, you've also got that kind of seamless transition into a more gangster rap sound. The American influences here are obvious. There's a Wu-Tang Clan and NWA and Mobb Deep and the like, which is not at all to say that there's French styles are a carbon copy of those pre-existing American styles. I mean, the way that, for example, MC Solar has integrated samples of older French language chansons, like by Serge Gainsbourg, into his music is incredibly interesting. And on top of that, I think the French language also really lends itself very well to hip-hop, to flows, to wordplay, which you'll see in a lot of these artists. But then by the early 2000s, you've got gangster rap becoming the predominant genre in French hip-hop. As the name would suggest, NTM are already kind of on the fringe to that, but I would say they're, still more in a kind of Public Enemy kind of hardcore hip-hop style, which isn't conscious hip-hop per se. I mean, it's very aggressive, very non-PC, and also very braggadocious, but at the same time, it comes from a place of very radical political anger. Whereas what comes afterwards, which we can now see take root in rappers like Oxmo Puccino and Booba, who was one half of Lunatique, there's a lot of overlap here. Many French rap fans would probably tell you that I Am is conscious rap and the NTM is a lot closer to gangster rap, which again shouldn't be surprising if you remember the origin of their name that I told you about. But I think there's still an observable difference between the very 90s sound of NTM, whereas what you see from the 2000s onwards, from the influence of American rappers like Jay-Z or NWA, is that instead you now have a celebration of pimp culture and of stories of petty crime, which you see in the aforementioned Booba. You also see that from the 2010s onwards, artists like Damso and Caris. And a lot of this kind of gets a bad rap among the French hip-hop public. It certainly hasn't been reevaluated to the same extent as NTM and I Am have been. And a lot of this is probably due to the fact that a lot of these rappers' current present-day musical output is shockingly bad, and a lot of their political views and criminal records are highly dubious. But at the same time, we shouldn't just skip over them, because their influence on the present-day French hip-hop scene is undeniable, and they have all put out some pretty good projects despite all of that, warts and all. Of course, what you also get in the 2000s is the influence of Eminem, who was enormously popular all over Europe, and you get a lot of suburban white boys influenced by the success of Eminem doing kind of horrorcore influenced styles of hardcore hip-hop that's intended to shock their audience. And in France, the one that's generally called the French Eminem is Orelsan, who, like Eminem, could take advantage of the color of his skin, but who, unlike Eminem, comes from a very bourgeois, educated background. And so I think the parallel is kind of disingenuous here, because Eminem, despite all his flaws, and he's not someone who I really like to listen to very much these days, was still very anchored in the black hip hop community of Detroit. And also, unlike Eminem, Orelsan has never really been good in the first place. Don't listen to any French rap fan that tells you Orelsan is worth listening to. He's not. Neither really are any of the other white boys that came in his wake in the 2010s. The sort of more or less conscious stuff of Lompal or of Nekfeu, and I don't know who else. You've got Bulak and all those other white boy rappers that followed in the wake of Orelsan in the early 2010s. I mean, this is probably the time when I'd say UK rap had the upper hand over French hip-hop, which again is obviously not to say that there are no good white French rappers. From slightly later of the cloud rap era, Nepal, may he rest in peace, was a brilliant rapper whose career was tragically cut short. But that is already a time by this point in the mid-2010s where we can see French hip-hop, like American hip-hop, splitting up into many, many different directions and subgenres, something that is enabled by the internet. And so, like with American hip-hop, I think the most interesting, forward-thinking, and just most enjoyable French hip-hop from the 2010s comes out of three subgenres and the subgenres underneath them: trap, cloud rap, and drill. And in trap, which is perhaps the most influential side of French hip-hop, you had Afro trap, which is still an ongoing phenomenon, a very distinctive southern French, Mediterranean, and even somewhat reggaeton-inspired party sound, which was pioneered by MHD and then also taken on by Jul. It's a style that has seen relatively little popularity in the US, but it has been omnipresent in all of Europe ever since. I mean, you've got rappers like J Hus bringing it over across the English Channel. And again, this was incredibly influential in the hip-hop scenes of other European countries, in particular on Germany, where it's been the sound of Berlin from the mid-2010s onwards. And, this is in particular a subgenre that I think a lot of purists scoff at. I mean, I think you don't tend to get taken seriously in French hip-hop circles when you mention Jul in a sort of a genuine context. But while, a lot of the stuff that comes out of this scene, and while a lot of stuff that Jul himself has done is incredibly whack, don't get me wrong, it's also an incredibly defining sound for an era that I think people are already feeling a lot of nostalgia for and will have more and more nostalgia for in the coming decades. And, it comes back down to sort of the rapper hip-hop debate again, because while, your sort of real hip-hop fans in France will tell you that the best, French rapper at the moment is probably Alpha One, who's great, don't get me wrong, but who at the same time has had quite a paltry output. I mean, he's got one proper album, one mixtape, and even that album is probably more like an 8 out of 10 rather than a 10 out of 10. And after that, there's just been a bunch of features, and it's just a bit too feeble for me to really kind of, consider him in that sort of defining way. If I'm honest with you, I think Alpha One is to me more like a slightly more talented J. Cole who doesn't take himself as seriously as J. Cole, but yeah, it is still kind of J. Cole performing at the highest level, which I just don't find that interesting myself. I find him a bit too technical and a bit too backwards looking in his musical approach. Whereas I think the more interesting stuff that's been occurring in French hip-hop is cloud rap, which is something that Jul has notably crossed into a lot of the time in a very sort of pop-oriented manner. But the real, quality cloud rap exponent from France is BNL, who are iconic and brilliant and maybe the easiest French rap project to get into, bar none. It's really not about the lyrics at all with them. It's just, individually recognizable songs with catchy elements, really distinguishable vocals, and really great production. And then lastly, you've also got drill in French hip-hop, which, spreads out a bit. It's less centered on individual artists and more like scenes like 13 Block, for example. But you've still got great individual rappers like Ziak is a favorite of mine. Also the controversial and problematic, but still talented Freeze Corleone. And then from COVID onwards, the 2020s that we're living in now, this has been an interesting situation in France where hip-hop is still today the dominating part of French musical culture, pretty much unlike anywhere else in the world. And this in particular is in contrast to a lot of other European countries where the popular singles charts for a while in the late 2010s were likewise inundated with a lot of up-and-coming rap stars, but where very quickly this is again ceded to the, standard international pop scene where it's Anglo-American pop stars that see success all across the globe. In France, if you look at the officially published singles charts of any given week, you'll usually find almost no English language songs whatsoever. Most of the placements in the top 10 will be French hip-hop, and this is not because of some different metric in the way, streams and stuff are measured. It's just because there is a genuinely huge cultural presence of hip-hop in France. But with that said, I think as good as that is for the genre of hip-hop, a lot of the cultural mainstays on the charts are fairly dull. Their sound tends to be quite stagnant at this point, unadventurous. It's guys like Naps, Niska, Nino. It's not just their names, it's also their sound that sounds the same. Worst of all, you've probably got Gims, who was previously part of the qualitatively dubious rap group Section d'Assaut, and who has since branched out into more of a kind of Afrobeat and R&B style. It's quite shallow and not really my cup of tea. You've got another few white guys seeing more success than they probably deserve, people like Bolak and Wald. But if you want to dive deeper into what's so great about contemporary French hip-hop culture, you'll want to go beyond that. You'll want to go into the more online and less commercially successful scenes, because it's online in underground rap communities, especially ones where subgenres like plug, like hyperpop, or again cloud rap have been adopted and have been, taken as an influence. And I'll be honest, I'm firstly not living in France, and I'm secondly a bit too old to be really tapped into all of these scenes, but every now and then I'll hear something coming out of one of these new French hip-hop scenes, and I'll be like, wow, for once the 14-year-olds on TikTok have actually got it exactly right. Winter Zuko is an excellent example of this, who's I think a bit of an influence on Irko in some respect. But before we get into some of these brilliant young and up-and-coming artists in the French underground, it's also interesting to observe the difference in background here, because as I pointed out, because I think this is important, the original wave of French hip-hop stars, IAM, NTM, they were all Maghrebin. And then you get an increasing representation of a Black African community with people like Damso and Caris. And then you have that kind of late 2000s, 2010s wave of privileged white kids. Like I said, that's the one that we want to forget about. And then we are in the SoundCloud generation today, where I would argue a process of democratization has taken place with respect to hip-hop, where, weird kids from no matter what background, be it ethnic or social, including from cities without a prominent local hip-hop community to find footing, can gain a reputation solely by dedicating themselves to their craft. I mean, this is what we've seen with the original Swedish wave of cloud rap. I remember very well how people used to laugh at Young Lean and Blady, how they were almost lolcows to a certain extent in the hip-hop community, but they're still going on, and they've got a discography and a track record of a caliber that at this point you can't really argue with anymore, even if you don't love their style. They are very clearly dedicated to hip-hop. And the same is not necessarily true for every SoundCloud rapper. In some ways, this increased accessibility and democratization has certainly led to some culture vultures. But on the positive side, it has brought artists, or in this case, artist-producer pairings, to the fore that are incredibly idiosyncratic and has allowed them to do whatever they want without any major label interference. Winter Zuko does that, just mentioned him there, with futuristic, fast-paced hyperpop rap. Petite Sœur does it with an industrial, queer, hardcore hip-hop sound. There's Famille Nombreuse, who does it by seamlessly making their own the punchline-heavy Detroit sound of rappers like Kashaquan and TJX6, or also New York's RXK Nephew. You've got Kerchak doing it with Jersey Drill. You've got Serran doing it with Dark Plug, as pioneered by the American Surf Gang Collective that he's in fact actively collaborated with. You've got Benjamin Epps doing it with a Griselda-style hardcore boom bap sound that's quite retro. You've got Angsty Camboy's Revenge and Tanas doing it with a digital sound similar to that of Jane Remover. And then you've got Irko Amne A, who are doing it with what Rap Genius tells me is a microgenre called warfare music that takes as its single biggest inspiration Call of Duty. Now bear with me for a second here, because rather than dismissing that on principle, I personally am a big believer in celebrating new genre movements, whatever they are. That doesn't mean that any new subgenre is automatically high quality or worthy of your attention. I mean, Stomp and Holler is technically a fairly recent genre, but I would say that it's by and large trash because there's very few interesting ideas that are being introduced in that scene. It's a very derivative simplification of older styles, if you ask me. And to be clear, I'm also not saying that it's impossible to make good, innovative music in older, well-trodden genres long after that genre's peak. But I do think that within hip-hop in particular, we are seeing so much creativity right now, so many new things being trialed by completely irreverent artists that a lot of mainstream hip-hop fans are just tuned out of, which I think is a shame. And to again return to American hip-hop, two concrete examples here of really fascinating new styles that have been largely dismissed. You've got Sexy Drill, as mastered by Cash Cobain and a horde of rappers and producers around him. And then you've got the slightly older and slightly more popular genre of Trap Soul, which takes its name from a Bryson Tiller album and which kind of does what it says on the tin. And, you know, those artists, they're rarely among the first to come to hip-hop fans' lips when talking about, you know, exciting stuff or the kind of the most influential rappers of a given era, the influential producers of a given era. But, you know, even as they're more commercially oriented than something like Plug or whatever, I think they're still very definitive of their given eras and of their scenes. And so I think people like Cash Cobain or Bryson Tiller absolutely deserve their due, even if they lack, you know, like a classic album without any skips, because they really helped bring about exciting new sounds, because they're absolutely new sounds. You're not going to mistake that for anything that was played on MTV in the 2000s. And so if we go back to Irko and Amne A and their Call of Duty style war music framework, I think that's a very valid framework for rap musicians to work in. I think it's a genuinely new and exciting sound. And obviously this doesn't apply just to Irko alone, but also to other rappers in their Lyon-based collective. There's quite a notable one that I'm not exactly endorsing or recommending, but that I think needs to be mentioned because of their breakout success in 2025. Femme Togo, who put out a really successful and really quite experimental collaborative album with the aforementioned Petite Sœur and also Néo-Front in 2025. But in the case of Femme Togo, it has sadly come out since that he has gone from being a victim of child sexual abuse himself to becoming a perpetrator of it. He's admitted to doing this, and so he has been cancelled just about as severely as you can get. So I'm not exactly recommending you seek out his sound, but you know, it merits a mention in the kind of broader development of this subgenre. And certainly you can draw international parallels to this war music sound as well. It definitely builds on the rage style of Playboi Carti and Ken Carson and Yeat, but then it pairs it with the more syncopated flow of Plug, and then also with electronic production courtesy of Amne A, which I think owes a big debt to trap, but not trap in hip hop, trap in electronic music. You know, the kind of wonky style sound of someone like Gesaffelstein in France, the DJ. And then on top of that already very disorienting and abrasive production, you've got Irko delivering these almost incomprehensible lyrics, which are drowning in gamer codes and slang and, you know, different languages, and in a style that was pioneered by Freeze Corleone, who I certainly don't love for his kind of political stance a lot of the time, but the style that he's pioneered is clearly a very influential one, and it's you know, a novel and really quite exciting approach to rap, to hip hop, which I think Irko, this really young Franco-Albanian kid, uses brilliantly by foregoing the need to pretend to be a gangster and instead inhabiting the one thing that he is really familiar with, which is war-themed video games like Call of Duty. And so I guess what I would want you to take from this is, well, for you to check out Irko and Amne A, and some of the other musicians that I've mentioned, some of the other musicians in their scene, go in with open ears and an open mind. You'll almost certainly not like it as much as me, which is fine, but the point that I'm making is that global hip-hop culture, France is just the one that I happen to be familiar with. I'm sure there's plenty of other countries with thriving hip-hop scenes that I just don't happen to be as well informed about. But all of it is so rich and variegated, even in niche pockets that, again, your average French hip-hop fan probably doesn't even know about, that you can just stumble onto genuinely new and exciting sounds almost by accident. And I think that's what makes this genre so wonderful and so continuously exciting. And so on that note, I hope you enjoyed this dive into the history of French hip-hop, which, again, I don't claim to be comprehensive. It is just my subjective opinion at the end of the day. You're allowed to disagree with it. You're allowed to tell me who I missed out on in the comments. And if you fancy more of this, I've got more videos on my channel, and I'll have new videos coming out going all the way to the top of this list soon-ish. So on that note, thanks for watching and salut.